Jamil Jaffer is the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute. He joins us now. And Jamil, I just want to get into it because beyond the finger-pointing politics of who is doing the worst job of managing the budget, there's this other concern surrounding the debt ceiling and national security. You know, this is an issue that's been raised by former defense secretaries Chuck Hagel and Leon Panetta. How serious are the national security ramifications here?
Well, Lauren, I think these are hugely problematic situations that we're walking ourselves into. The idea that the United States might default on its debt and not make good on its commitments that it has done for 200 years could be catastrophic for our national security. I think Secretaries Panetta and Hagel are exactly right that politics should be taken out of this. We need to come to a consensus in this nation about raising the debt ceiling, about the appropriate level of budget cuts that are necessary to do that, to get our growing, ballooning budget deficit under control. We need to do that now, and putting it off, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, the White House or the Speaker, we need to figure this out and figure it out now.
And let's talk about, we got to figure this out. But while they are, what does this tell our allies? I mean, what kind of message is this putting out into the world, seeing this kind of back and forth?
Well, it's obviously a terrible message to our allies. The idea that we can't get our own fiscal house in order and pay the debts that we've already incurred sends a message to our allies that we are not reliable, that we are not consistent. The dollar will almost certainly be pummeled. Our standing in the world will be harmed if we don't get through this and solve this. Now, we've come up to this limit a number of times before, and cooler heads have prevailed, and we've found a resolution. But that requires both sides to negotiate. Unfortunately, both sides seem dug in. The White House doesn't seem willing to negotiate at all on budget issues. The Republicans don't seem to be willing to negotiate on a short-term extension. We need to come together and find a middle ground here and get this thing off the plate. We're already past the debt limit, Lauren, and the Treasury Department's already taking extraordinary measures. Now is the time to solve this, not putting it off till the fall or the winter.
When you say that this can be catastrophic when it comes to national security, for the person watching, what are the greatest national security risks at play here? What does that actually look like?
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns is that people start pivoting away from the U.S. dollar to other reserve currencies, that they start looking to our adversaries like China and suggest that maybe their currency might be used as a reserve currency rather than the U.S. dollar. If, in fact, we hit the debt limit, it's likely the dollar will suffer, our standing in the world will suffer. And at the end of the day, it makes our allies less willing to rely on the U.S. and our commitments across a range of measures if we don't meet our most basic commitments to honor our debt that has long been the debt of choice for investors and for the globe because of the full faith and credit of the U.S. government.
And as you walk through this, I'm just thinking, because, this is something that could affect every American, essentially. What are some of the things that concern you the most as you list kind of the domino effect that this would have?
Well, it'll raise the cost of our nation's borrowing going forward if we're not viewed as a reliable payer, just as, a consumer would. If they didn't pay their debts, if you don't pay your credit card bill or your loans, your interest rates are going to go up, and eventually banks are going to stop loaning to you. The same is going to happen to U.S. debt. That means more costly goods for Americans around the globe. It means gas prices certainly will increase. It'll increase our potential for inflation. None of this is good for the U.S. dollar and for our economy net across the board. The exact economic consequences, hard to know because we've never actually defaulted on our debt. But if you look at other nations that have, the economic consequences are catastrophic in those nations.
Let me take the time here with this last question as we wrap up our conversation. You have worked at the White House and the Department of Justice. Have we reached a point where a debt ceiling law that was first put into place in 1917 has become dangerously outdated? Or is it time to find a way to tie the budget to the debt ceiling in some way? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, Lauren. I think that we have long had a challenge with getting our budget deficits in order. The U.S. can and should borrow money to finance operations. But at some point, we keep going further and further into debt. We have massive amounts of mandatory spending. We have significant amounts of discretionary spending. We cannot solve this problem solely on the back of discretionary spending. We've got to tie the budget negotiations and the debt limit together. And frankly, we ought to tie member Congresses and the president's pay to these issues as well. Nobody should be getting paid if we can't solve our budget deficit and can't solve our debt limit problems.
Jamil Jaffer with the National Security Institute. Thank you for your insight, sir. And all eyes will be on that meeting tomorrow. We'll see how this plays out. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.